All right, deep divers. Welcome back to another deep dive with us.
It's great to be back.
Today we're going to be looking at Iran's energy crisis, and we're going to be doing that with this really interesting video report that looks at this issue.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that just strikes me immediately is like, when you think of Iran, you think of like an energy giant, right?
You do.
Like one of the world's biggest oil and gas reserves. And yet here we are talking about an energy crisis. So like, what's going on there?
Yeah, well, it's kind of this fascinating paradox that unfolds in the report where you have this country with this incredible wealth of energy resources, but they are facing a crippling energy crisis, especially this winter. Schools and universities and banks and even highways are experiencing these rolling blackouts or even closures.
It's amazing. And like, I think the thing that's really interesting about the report is that it goes beyond just like, oh, it's a cold winter and there are some blackouts.
Yeah.
And it really sort of digs into like the systemic issues and the historical context and sort of how we got to this point.
Yeah, it's not just this, superficial issue. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah. And I mean, like,
Yeah.
how do you even begin to sort of explain that? Like, how does a country with so much oil and gas end up in a situation like this?
Well, the report really breaks down into, I think, three key factors.
Mm.
You have decades of sanctions that have really crippled their economy and their ability to invest in infrastructure.
Yeah.
Then you have chronic underinvestment in their energy infrastructure.
Right.
And then you have this culture of energy consumption that has been really fostered by these heavily subsidized energy prices. So it's kind of this perfect storm.
Yeah, I mean, the scale of the problem is just kind of mind-boggling when you think about it.
It is.
Like, it's not just like, oh, the lights flicker every now and then. It's like people's lives are being seriously disrupted.
Yeah, and imagine trying to run a business or just go about your daily life when you have no idea if the electricity is going to be on or off.
Like, even basic things.
Yeah, like heating your home or cooking a meal or, getting to work or school, it becomes incredibly difficult.
And like, I mean, we all know this winter has been particularly brutal, but the report really makes it clear that this isn't just a seasonal thing, right?
No, absolutely not. This crisis has been brewing for years.
Yeah.
It's a result of these long-term structural problems that I mentioned.
And it really sort of underscores, I think, this idea that neglecting crucial infrastructure can have like really devastating consequences.
It's a cautionary tale for any country, really.
For sure.
You can't just ignore these things. They need constant attention and investment.
Yeah, and the report doesn't shy away from like the economic fallout either.
Yeah.
Like Iran's economy is in a really bad place right now. Industrial output is plummeting. The currency is just like in free fall.
Yeah, it's a really dire situation.
And it really shows how closely connected energy security and economic stability really are.
Oh, absolutely. Energy is the lifeblood of any modern economy. And when that supply is disrupted, everything else starts to fall apart.
And I think it's really easy to get caught up in like the numbers, the economic indicators and all of that.
Right.
But the report does a really good job of reminding us that this is about real people.
Right. It is.
Yeah.
These are people's lives that are being affected by this crisis.
Millions of Iranians are struggling to cope with like the consequences of this.
Exactly. They're facing job losses, dwindling incomes, and just a general sense of uncertainty about the future.
So you've got this kind of like internal crisis going on, but then the report also sort of digs into like Iran's geopolitical maneuvering.
Right.
And it really kind of raises some eyebrows. Like, how is this even possible?
Well, it's this fascinating juxtaposition, right? You have this country that's facing this mounting internal crisis, and yet they're still pouring billions of dollars into supporting allies in Syria and building this network of regional proxies.
It's just incredible when you think about it.
Yeah, the report estimates that they've spent over $20 billion in the last decade on these ventures.
And the crazy thing is, that's almost exactly what the International Energy Agency estimated they needed.
Right.
To modernize their energy infrastructure.
To bring their energy grid up to date.
It's just like,
it's really striking.
talk about misplaced priorities.
Right. Yeah, it's a really interesting case study in how a government's priorities can sometimes be at odds with the needs of its people.
So on the one hand, you've got like this massive spending on foreign adventures.
Right.
And on the other hand, you've got like this crumbling energy infrastructure
Exactly.
at home.
And it's the Iranian people who are ultimately paying the price.
And then you add to that like the whole issue of energy subsidies, which the report also goes into quite a bit of detail about.
Right.
And I mean, like, Iranians have long enjoyed these heavily subsidized energy prices,
Yes, gasoline prices in Iran are some of the lowest in the world.
like unbelievably low.
I mean, to give you an idea, a liter of gasoline in Iran costs less than 10 US cents.
It's like cheaper than a can of soda in a lot of places.
Yeah, it's really remarkable.
So on the surface, it sounds great, right?
Yeah, it seems like a great deal for consumers.
Cheap energy for everyone.
But it's created this culture of high energy consumption.
Yeah.
And it's put a massive strain on the government's budget.
So it's like this kind of like this trap almost, right?
It's a classic case of short-term gain for long-term pain.
And the report really highlights this dilemma that it creates for the government.
Absolutely.
Like, how do you even begin to address these unsustainable energy subsidies
Right.
without, like, causing massive social unrest?
It's a real political tightrope walk.
I mean, we saw what happened in 2019, right?
Exactly. The last time they tried to raise fuel prices even just a little bit, it sparked these massive protests.
Yeah.
It was the deadliest unrest since the 1979 revolution.
And so, like, that's where we kind of leave things for now. But we're going to come back after a quick break, and we're going to delve into, like, what are the potential solutions? What does the future hold for Iran's energy sector?
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating discussion.
So stick around, energy enthusiasts. We'll be right back. So, welcome back, everyone. We were talking about Iran's energy crisis, and specifically those 2019 riots. I mean, that's pretty scary stuff, right?
Yeah, those riots were a real wake-up call, I think, for Iran's leaders. You know, they showed just how sensitive the issue of energy subsidies is and how quickly things can spiral out of control.
It's like this dark cloud hanging over the whole situation, right?
Absolutely. Any attempt to reform those subsidies to bring prices closer to market levels, it's just incredibly risky.
It's like a political powder keg just waiting to explode.
Exactly. And with the economy already in such a fragile state, it's a really tough situation for the government to be in.
Yeah, they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
That's a good way to put it.
So, like, how do you even begin to address this problem?
Right.
I mean, is there any way out of this mess without, like, triggering another wave of unrest?
Well, it's definitely a complex challenge. There's no easy fix, but the report does suggest a few potential pathways.
Okay, so, like, what are we talking about here?
Well, one key aspect is diversifying Iran's energy mix right now. They're heavily reliant on natural gas, which makes them vulnerable to these kinds of supply disruptions.
So we're talking about, like, shifting towards renewables, things like solar and wind.
Exactly. Iran actually has huge potential for solar energy development. I mean, they get a ton of sunlight,
Yeah, true.
and they have vast areas of land that would be suitable for solar farms.
So in theory, they could really become a solar powerhouse.
They could. It would require a massive investment, of course, but the potential is definitely there.
So let's talk about the hurdles, because I imagine there are quite a few, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, firstly, you've got the upfront costs of transitioning to renewables. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars.
And with their economy already struggling to stay afloat, it's like, where's that money going to come from?
Exactly. And then you have the sanctions, which have made it incredibly difficult for them to access international financing and technology.
Right, they're kind of cut off from the global economy in a lot of ways.
They are, and that makes things even more challenging.
And then, of course, there's the political dimension, right? Like we've already talked about how sensitive the issue of energy subsidies is.
Right.
So even if they could find the money to invest in renewables, how do you convince the public to accept higher energy prices?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like after they've been used to these super low prices for so long.
For decades.
Yeah, it's a really tough sell.
It is. It would require a lot of careful planning and communication from the government.
I mean, are there any examples of countries that have successfully managed this kind of transition?
There are some. I mean, it's not easy, but it's definitely possible.
And like, what are some of the key lessons from those success stories?
Well, one thing that seems to be crucial is a phased approach. You know, you don't try to do everything overnight.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You gradually phase out the subsidies over time, and you implement social safety nets to protect the most vulnerable households.
So you kind of cushion the blow a little bit.
Exactly. And you also need to invest heavily in public education campaigns to explain to people why these changes are necessary and what the long-term benefits will be.
So transparency is key.
Transparency and communication are absolutely essential.
Okay, so we've talked about diversifying the energy mix. We've talked
Yeah.
about the challenges of reforming those energy subsidies. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the geopolitical dimension of this crisis,
Sure.
because that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
It does, and this is where things get particularly interesting. The report alleges that Israel has actually played a role in exacerbating Iran's energy woes.
Wait, what are we talking about here? Like sabotage or something?
Well, they specifically mention an alleged airstrike on gas pipelines in 2024.
Wow, that's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and it's one that's difficult to independently verify, but it does highlight the deep mistrust and hostility between these two countries.
Yeah, and how that can spill over into the energy domain.
Absolutely. And it's not just Israel. You also have the U.S., which has been tightening sanctions on Iran.
Right, and that just makes it even harder for them to address their energy problem.
It does. It limits their access to foreign investment and technology.
So it's like this vicious cycle.
In a way, it is.
They're struggling with these internal energy problems, but then those problems are made worse by these external pressures.
Exactly. And that's what makes this situation so volatile and unpredictable.
So it's not just about, like, fixing pipelines and building solar farms.
No, it's about navigating this complex web of geopolitical rivalries and economic sanctions.
That's like a high-stakes game of energy chess.
That's a good analogy.
So with all that in mind, let's try to look ahead and talk about what the future might hold for Iran's energy sector. What are some of the potential scenarios that we should be watching for?
Okay, let's do that.
So we've been digging into this energy crisis in Iran, but like, what happens next? I mean, what does the future hold?
Well, if we had a crystal ball, this would be a lot easier.
Right.
But, we can look at some possibilities.
Okay.
One thing that could happen is that Iran just kind of muddles through.
Muddles through.
They make some small changes, maybe tweak the subsidies a little bit,
Right.
do some minor upgrades to their infrastructure,
Okay.
but they don't really address those big underlying issues.
So basically just kicking the can down the road.
Pretty much, yeah. And, they might be able to keep the lights on for now,
Yeah.
but it's not a sustainable solution.
Right. Eventually they're going to run into the same problems again.
Exactly. They'll be vulnerable to the next energy shock.
Okay. So that's kind of a pessimistic scenario.
Yeah, I mean, it's not ideal.
So is there like a more optimistic scenario, like a path where Iran actually comes out of this stronger?
There is, but it would require some pretty significant changes,
Okay.
like a real commitment to transforming their energy sector.
So like what would that look like?
Well, they would need to invest heavily in modernizing their grid, improving energy efficiency,
Yeah.
and really diversifying their energy mix.
So like going big on renewables.
Exactly, solar in particular. But it's not just about building new power plants. They also need to reduce energy consumption
Okay.
through efficiency measures, smart grids, and really changing consumer behavior.
So it's like a whole societal shift.
It would be like,
Yeah.
like a nationwide energy diet.
I mean, that's a pretty tall order, right? Especially for a country that's used to having cheap energy.
It is. It would require strong leadership.
Yeah.
And a lot of public buy-in.
But I mean, if they could pull it off, the rewards would be huge.
Oh, absolutely. They would be less reliant on fossil fuels. They would have a cleaner environment.
Yeah.
And their economy would be more
It's
robust.
like a win-win-win.
Potentially.
Yes.
But like you said, it's a big if.
Right. And let's not forget about those external factors, the sanctions, the geopolitical tensions.
Yeah, those are still wild cards.
They are. And they could really derail any attempts at reform.
So it's like all these internal challenges plus all these external pressures.
Exactly. It's a tough situation.
So what would it actually look like for like the average Iranian if they did manage to make this transition? Well, in the short term, there would probably be some economic pain.
Like higher energy prices.
Yeah, because they would have to phase out those subsidies.
Right.
But in the long run, it could lead to a cleaner environment, more reliable energy access, and a stronger, more diversified economy.
So it's like a long-term investment.
Exactly. It's about sacrificing some short-term comfort for long-term gain.
But it's a gamble, right?
It is. There are no guarantees.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. It's clear that Iran's energy future is full of uncertainty.
It is.
But it's a fascinating story, and one that we'll be following closely.
Absolutely.
So, energy enthusiasts, we want to hear from you. What do you think are the most critical factors shaping Iran's energy future?
Yeah, share your thoughts in the comments below.
And be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world of energy and geopolitics.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those energy debates flowing.